Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real American History. I'm your host, Tess Evans, public historian. And the topic of today's episode is what's known as Indian removal. Now, just like always, I will start with a little bit of context and some background information. So, the whites who are here in America began settling the land that we gained from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Which was the western, southern, and southeastern lands. And they wanted to use this land to farm, build plantations, expand slavery, and basically continue to build their empire. And they saw the indigenous peoples who were living there at the exact same time as obstacles to their goals. And it didn't matter that these indigenous peoples had lived there for thousands and thousands of years. But the whites thought that they were ordained from God to settle these new lands and push westward in the United States, no matter who or what got in their way. And that is a concept known as manifest destiny, which I will cover in a future episode. But the most prominent Native American tribes living in the southeastern United States that we'll focus on for this episode are the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole. These were known as the 5 civilized tribes because some had begun adopting some aspects of white culture. So we get this concept of removal of Native Americans early in our republic's history. Thomas Jefferson thought that natives should be removed from their eastern lands to the west, which was adopted by later presidents Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren after him during the 1830s. And between this time, there had been violence and intense struggle between whites and natives, both fighting to keep the land that they thought belonged to them. And there were treaties signed, and these treaties a lot of them were broken, and the conflict, of course, kept going. And as a solution, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Andrew Jackson, which said that Indian nations should surrender, if I could say that, surrender their homelands to the government in exchange for lands west of the Mississippi River. And the government promised food and provisions and basic protection during their journey west. And this was all going to be accomplished through yet more treaties. And here are some lines from the act that I'd like to read. Quote, "And be it further enacted, that it shall and may be lawful for the President to have the same superintendence and care over any tribe or nation in the country to which they may remove, as contemplated by this act, that he is now authorized to have over them at their present places of residence, provided that nothing in this act contained shall be construed as authorizing or directing the violation of any existing treaty between the United States and any of the Indian tribes," end quote. And there were, of course, opponents to the act, aside from natives, including Jeremiah Evarts. He was a Protestant missionary who argued that forcing Cherokees, in this case he was talking about the Cherokees, from their homelands actually violated Christian principles. And Catherine Beecher, who was a reformer in Connecticut, encouraged women to petition Congress against this legislation. And the Cherokee themselves, in addressing the people of the United States, said, quote, "If we are compelled to leave our country, we see nothing but ruin before us," end quote. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws signed treaties and began immigrating westward. And the Creeks, though, held out for about as long as they could until war broke out in what is known as the First and Second Creek Wars. But eventually, federal troops forced them to move west, and thousands of Creeks died during their removal. And in December of 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French diplomat, philosopher, and historian who was in the United States at this time, saw the Choctaw cross a partially frozen Mississippi River, and he believed that the removal of entire American Indian nations and the denial of their natural rights contradicted the ideals of American democracy. And here is his description of what he saw. It's a bit of a long quote, so hang with me here. Quote, "At the end of the year 1831, whilst I was on the left bank of the Mississippi at a place named by Europeans, Memphis, there arrived a numerous band of Choctaws. These savages had left their country and were endeavoring to gain the right bank of the Mississippi, where they hoped to find an asylum which had been promised them by the American government. It was then the middle of winter, and the cold was unusually severe. The snow had frozen hard upon the ground, and the river was drifting huge masses of ice. The Indians had their families with them, and they brought in their train the wounded and sick, with children newly born and old men upon the verge of death. They possessed neither tents nor wagons, but only their arms and some provisions. I saw 373 of them embarked past the mighty river, and never will that solemn spectacle fade from my remembrance. No cry, no sob was heard amongst the assembled crowd. All were silent. Their calamities were of ancient date, and they knew them to be irremediable. The Indians had all stepped into the bark which was to carry them across, but their dogs remained upon the bank. As soon as these animals perceived that their masters were finally leaving the shore, they set up a dismal howl, and plunging altogether into the icy waters of the Mississippi, they swam after the boat." End quote. Now, the Cherokees refused to leave their homelands, which were in Georgia, and they were constantly harassed by whites who were trying to take their land. Their chief, known as John Ross, did not sign a removal treaty, but other leaders of the Cherokee Nation did. And there's an argument about these other Cherokee leaders, whether they were really recognized as part of the official Cherokee Nation. But these other leaders had signed a treaty of removal. So Ross and over 15,000 other Cherokees signed a petition in protest of this. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. But the court ignored their demands and ratified the treaty in 1836, basically saying, "We are forcing you to move west." The Cherokee were given 2 years to leave voluntarily, and by 1838, only about 2,000 had left, but around 16,000 had stayed. Because of this, the U.S. government sent about 7,000 troops into Georgia and forced the Cherokees into stockade, holding them at bayonet point. They weren't allowed to take their belongings with them at all, and as they left, whites went in and looted their homes. They began their march from Georgia into what is now Oklahoma, and because the government did not provide food, medicine, basic care, anything that they said they would, there was around 4,000 Cherokees who died along the way. And this was known as the Trail, or has become known as the Trail of Tears. The Seminoles were victims of fraud in a removal treaty that they signed, and warfare ensued with them and the whites for several years. And the Seminoles were living in Florida, and they raided forts and fought with federal troops as well. A truce was finally called in 1842, which allowed about 500 Seminoles to stay in Florida. And as Native Americans settled in Oklahoma from all these tribes, they were riddled with disease. There was a missionary who was coming by at this time who recorded, quote, "We did not visit a house, wigwam, or camp where we did not find more or less sickness, and in most instances the whole family were prostrated by disease. Great number of them have died." End quote. Within a few decades, whites were wanting more land farther west and continued to force natives to surrender their newly acquired lands and relocate them to reservations, some of which still exist today. So that's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like these videos, please hit that subscribe button. And as always, I have resources and further reading materials listed in the description so that you can explore more on this topic. Hopefully, I will see you all next time. And until then, take care.